I think that means that we are ready to dive into this next session, everyone. So welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to see you all. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Dr. Robin Waite, and I am the Policy and Advocacy Manager with Results Canada. So just before we dive into our session, I just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping. We do want to see and hear from many of you during this discussion. So if you're comfortable doing so, please do turn on your camera. It's really lovely to see human faces. And do feel free to use the chat box as much as you like. Use your emojis. I love it when I see little hearts flying by my screen. So please do get ready to engage because we're going to have the opportunity to ask questions of our esteemed speaker today. So now that some housekeeping is sorted, I would like to start by paying respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of the land where the Office of Results Canada is in Ottawa, Canada. We at Results acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. The Algonquin people have lived on this land since time immemorial, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory today. So for this session, we are very fortunate to be able to hear from Alex Palacios. I literally just called Alex to make sure I got his pronunciation right and said it to myself beautifully a number of times, and then I just choked up. So I'm so sorry about that, Alex.
No worries. Palacios,
who is a director with the Global Partnership for Education. And I will let him introduce himself in a moment. But first, I want to give you a bit of an overview of the purpose of this session. So really, it is to hear and learn from Alex about the Global Partnership for Education Raise Your Hand campaign. At Results Canada, our volunteers will be taking action in support of the campaign from May through to the end of July. Because we know that access to quality education is critical for children everywhere to learn, grow, and secure bright futures, we intend to work really hard to secure an ambitious pledge from the Canadian government. The Global Partnership for Education aims to raise at least $5 billion to transform education systems for more than 1 billion girls and boys in up to 90 countries and territories. And with the pandemic creating the biggest crisis in education in history, the need to step our support up for education has never been greater. Okay, Alex, so before we dive into our discussion, could you please take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be able to spend this time with you. If my last name were Pelosi, then I think the challenge that we're facing would be a lot easier to resolve, be able to get the monies very quickly. I've been working in global development since the early 1980s. I was at Peace Corps and at the Inter-American Foundation as a legal counsel for a number of years before taking on positions at UNICEF, where I worked for 15 years, USAID during the Clinton administration, and then at Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, which I know Results is very familiar with and has supported for many years, before joining GPE in 2013. It's kind of like going full circle, because when I first began working in Washington in the mid-1970s, I was actually working for an organization that was focused on expanding access for Hispanic high school students to college and to help them transition into college, including ensuring financial aid. So that's my summary. I just did want to say that I've had the pleasure of working with Results, first in the US and then in Canada and elsewhere, since 1986. My introduction to good advocacy, smart advocacy, was as a result of having the opportunity to meet Sam Harris pretty early on in my years at UNICEF. And he really helped me understand why your particular approach is so valuable and so important. And I can just tell you that the Child Survival Fund, which was created here in the US around that time, would never have been created, would never have grown without Results' great advocacy work.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. So what's going to happen is I'm going to pose a few questions to Alex so that he can tell us more about the Global Partnership for Education. And then we're going to open the floor up to have you pose questions to Alex. So this is really your opportunity to pick his brain. So I'll kick things off with a bit of an icebreaker question. Before we get serious, Alex, we'd like to get to know you a little bit better. So could you please share with us a story about a time you felt particularly inspired and motivated by the work that you do?
Sure. I think I have really two responses to that, two quick responses. I've been inspired by both people and events. And I'll start out by talking about people that I've had the opportunity to get to know and to work with closely. Jim Grant was executive director of UNICEF when I first joined, the son and grandson of missionaries in China. He seemed to work 24 hours a day and willing to go to any length to move the needle on child survival and development. I think for those who might recall the original formula for that program, growth monitoring, oral rehydration therapy to combat diarrheal diseases, breastfeeding and immunization, basic strategies today, but not necessarily fully comprehended back then. But I learned that it wasn't really work for him, it was his life. And understanding that that was how he lived every day was to think about how not just himself as a person who was working and leading an organization, but literally all the people around him and the people he came into contact with could be avenues through which progress could be made. And now, of course, decades later, literally millions of lives are saved every year because of those strategies being in place around the world. And both the person, Jim Grant, and the progress inspire me to just keep punching. The second is a field visit. I went to Somalia for an extended field visit in the mid-1990s, which also inspired me, traveling around the country by plane because roads were not safe, still very much an unsafe place to go. Accompanied literally by armed guards, told not to walk in front of windows in the evening with the lights on in the room for fear of sniper fire. There was a dedicated, sort of traveling around, I met a dedicated Spanish pediatrician and a French surgeon working there, supported by UNICEF, literally addressing the needs of thousands of people. They were the only healthcare people in the entire area. This was in Hargeisa. And their energy and positivity were extraordinary. They embraced everything they did with a smile and with energy. And I had been the first senior person visiting there for quite some time. I think those of who might remember the history, Black Hawk Down had occurred perhaps 18 months before that. So it was a pretty difficult time. Anyway, those people inspired me greatly.
Thanks so much, Alex. And I'll just echo that it's people that inspire me to do my job as well. And it's a lot of those that are in the room with us today that are taking meaningful, high impact action because they care about making positive change in the world. Okay, so as I already mentioned at the start of our session, Results Canada will indeed be starting a 3-month-long campaign in support of the Global Partnership for Education, kicking off in May. And I'm sure that the U.S. will be engaged in this advocacy as well. So could you please tell our audience a little bit about the Global Partnership for Education and why our advocacy efforts over the course of May to July will be critical to your work?
Sure. First of all, let me just say your timing is absolutely perfect. It couldn't be better. We are approaching the 100-day countdown to the GPE's 4th financing conference, the Global Education Summit, you may have already heard about, which will be held in London in late July, July 28, 29, in again, just a few months. But the G7 meeting, the G7 summit, which the UK is chairing, will happen even sooner in the early part of June. The UK is coincidentally both the co-host of the GPE Financing Summit, as well as the G7, working with the government of Kenya and of course other G7 leaders. And girls' education is one of the top development issues already confirmed to be on the agenda, as it is has been a priority for Boris Johnson throughout his tenure. So your timing is perfect for your advocacy campaign. GPE, to say a little something about the organization, is now approaching 20 years since it was first established. It's the only global partnership and fund exclusively dedicated to transforming education systems in more than 75 poor countries, with 90 countries eligible total, and ensuring that all girls and boys have access to quality education, equal access, and that's quite a challenge in so many countries. Our job is to mobilize partnerships and financing to transform education systems so that no child is lacking access to a basic quality education. Majority of support is going to sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and also Central Asia and a few countries in the Latin America and Caribbean region. More than half of our support goes to countries experiencing fragility and or conflict. GPE is the largest donor for education access and continuity of education, for example, in Yemen. Most people I'm sure know about the 5-year civil war that's taken place there. The GPE has committed $70 million to Yemen. There is no other donor, specifically for education, there is no other donor that has reached anywhere near that level of support. Overall, we've mobilized about $7 billion over the past 2 decades to support our growing number of developing country partners. Our annual disbursements to these countries last year exceeded $1 billion. And every few years, we have to appeal for more support from our donors for the next multi-year period. And that's what this particular conference is all about. Robin mentioned our goals are to raise at least $5 billion to support our work from the year 2021, the current year, through 2025. And I might note that we are approaching, at the end of that period, only 5 years left for achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, including for education. So it's very time sensitive in that regard. Our main goals, in addition to just the big number of 1 billion children to be supported, we want to be able to reach 140 million students over that period with trained teachers, 88 million more children, with 46 million of these girls in school, and more efficient and effective use of domestic financing for education. Our goal is to really bring together all of the key partners, both at global level to coordinate policies and approaches to global education, but also at national level to ensure that all partners are working toward the same objectives in a sector where there is so much fragmentation and there is such scarce financing, to ensure that those who are active in countries are working in concert, crowding in their resources, and all aiming in the same direction.
Great, thank you so much for that. So we're quite concerned at Results how the pandemic is wiping off years of progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. We understand that because of COVID-19, the world is currently facing the biggest crisis of education in history. Can you speak a little bit to how the pandemic has created challenges for the Global Partnership for Education and what the current risks to children everywhere gaining access to quality education are in this new context and reality that we're living in?
Well, thank you, Robin. COVID is indeed the greatest crisis in global education that we have seen. It's a combination of its expanse. It has literally shut down schools everywhere across the globe, and it all happened so suddenly, without any preparation time, without any sort of ability to develop contingency plans. It just happened literally just about overnight. More than 1 billion children and, of course, all of their teachers were impacted. There was a real huge potential here to set back progress and access for girls in particular, particularly as the months go by. GPE quickly mobilized over $500 million to be able to respond to the COVID crisis and developed an accelerated financing window so that we could provide very quickly almost 65 of our developing country partners quick financing so that they could respond to the school closures, put in alternative approaches such as distance learning, delivery of books and material to communities, material that would help them provide some guidance on how to use the materials, to be able to use radio and television and mobile devices to provide some level of education. And also, perhaps importantly, to help and support the preparation for the safe return to the classroom once classes are reopened. And I should note at this time that you have a situation in the developing countries similar to what we're seeing here, in that schools might reopen for a while, then suddenly the rates go up and the schools close again. So it's not as if it's a straight line. It seems to go back and forth. We do know that there is an opportunity for some of these developing countries to view the challenge that has emerged suddenly and so seriously at the same time as an opportunity to leapfrog and to think about ways to address the connectivity challenges that they have, particularly digital connectivity, to find ways to reach populations that weren't being reached in the first place, and actually in some cases are being reached now. How do you learn from this? How do you expand that? And I happen to work in an area at GPE that involves engagement with the private sector and foundations. And there is very strong interest within the business community, as well as in some corners of philanthropy, to look at those opportunities and perhaps to provide some support, either in kind and or cash support, so that countries can accelerate their connectivity, so that classrooms everywhere are increasingly connected. It's really about communities being connected, but through classrooms or through health clinics. UNICEF itself has a particularly interesting initiative called the GIGA initiative, which is designed to do that, and GPE is providing some of its experience in innovative financing to help move that forward. You had a question to me also, Robin? I thought about risks to children gaining access. Is that part of the same question?
Yep, part of the same question. The second part was the current risks to children everywhere getting access.
I would answer that just very, very briefly, very quickly. I think the three main obstacles are conflict and instability. More than half of GPE support goes to countries that are fragile and or conflict affected. It seems to be just a growing phenomenon around the world. There's so many, one only has to turn on the news to know that there's so many ongoing conflicts, political instability. It's really tragic. So we have perhaps 60% of our annual support goes to countries in that category, and approaching 45% of the countries that we support are in that category as well. Of course, insufficient financing and existing financing not being used in the most efficient, effective ways. Those are two things we have to look at, not just raising the 5 billion plus that is needed to really transform education systems so that they can more reliably deliver education to an ever-growing number of children and youth, but also to ensure that the resources that are being applied are being used as most effectively. And the last I would say is really a very old problem and a challenging one. Traditional norms, keeping particularly girls out of school or preventing them from transitioning from primary education, if they're lucky to be there, into lower secondary and then moving on through full secondary. We're trying to work to address that, actually in partnership with some business partners who have fantastic marketing and advocacy and communications capacity, increasingly in poorer countries, and working with them, given lessons we learned from the HIV/AIDS challenge back in the 80s, of using literally advertising and communications to reach poorer communities, to help them understand the value and to change those norms.
Great, thank you so much for that really in-depth response. I know that our audience would have heard yesterday from Taryn Russell, who works with Save the Children Canada, a little about COVID COVID-19, climate, conflict, and children. And just to flag that for the first month of our campaign, we are going to focus in on children living in fragile or conflict afflicted settings, and we'll be hearing from Taryn again. So stay tuned to learn more about that. Results Canada volunteers. One final question from me before I open the floor for questions from our audience. So everybody start thinking, what do you want to ask Alex while we have him? Be thinking about how you can get information from him that can support you in your advocacy efforts over the next few months. So while you're all thinking, my last question for you, Alex, is about, despite the many challenges of COVID-19, how are education programs innovating? Can you give us some particularly exciting examples of program innovation? And are there any innovations or opportunities in changes to ways of working that could actually be leveraged to improve access to quality education worldwide?
Yeah, I mean, I think the examples that most excite me, and particularly given the role that I play at GPE, are the examples that have to do with countries such as the Gambia, which are engaging increasingly, not just with global development partners such as GPE or UNICEF or the World Bank, but are also reaching out to both business partners in working in and sort of growing out of the developing countries themselves, but also global partners such as Microsoft or a Tableau that are providing their skills, their expertise, and their platforms, and often either free of charge or for fairly very low levels of charge, so that these countries can strengthen, for example, their data systems. One of the things that countries suffer, and we see this at GPE across the board, there's such a low percentage of countries, below 25%, can fully report across all of the key data points for our results framework. It's because their data systems are weak. They just don't have the capacity. They don't have the platforms. The education management information systems aren't strong enough or fully functional to be able to deliver the kind of information. It's not just to us, but to deliver it for themselves, for their own use, so that they have a much better picture of how their students and how their schools are doing, schools in far-flung parts of the country. There are ID systems that are being established, which will help provide, integrates data, and it helps the district offices and the National Education Ministry to understand, have a clear picture. What is really happening? How are resources being used? What's happening with the teachers and the relationship between teachers who are being paid and who's showing up for class. So I get excited by things like that I think are very practical, very specific, kind of nuts and boltsy, but it's what it's all about. I have a tendency to think of education as in a kind of a retail sense. We're often talking about these global policies, but at the end of the day, it's about what happens when a child walks into a school. Can we as parents, or we as supporters and promoters of education, feel comfortable that that child will receive that quality education, that all the books will be there, the teacher will be trained, meals, if necessary, will be provided. In a sense, that's a retail operation happening all across countries, all around the world. And one of the things that I think the business community often is able to do is to ensure success at that retail level. They're not the full answer. They're not the only answer. One has to be careful about identifying the right business partners. But at the end of the day, they are part of the equation. They've been part of the global partnership from the beginning, and we should be tapping into their resources.
I think that's really interesting, just to hear you speak how, thinking of education from a hub and spoke perspective, of how education really is the center of not just learning for our children, but also a place where additional critical services for children and their families can also be provided. So routine immunizations, meals, as you said, safe spaces for children.
Testing vision.
Testing vision, exactly. So it's not just about education, it's also all those other critical care services we can get to kids, and also then what that allows for families. So we've seen my sister here in Canada, for example, without having a place for her kids to go to school, like she's really had to seriously question whether or not she works or stays home and looks after her kids now. So also, how does education support some of the other goals of the SDGs? Okay, so I'm going to leave it there because I see questions from the audience flooding in, which is awesome. I might suggest we turn our view into more of a gallery view so it can be a back and forth exchange with everybody that's in the room with us today. I'm not sure if that's possible to unspotlight us. And I do welcome those of you who have questions to unmute yourself and actually verbally pose the question. So right now, I see first question that came in was from Roger Hudson. Roger, would you like to unmute yourself to pose your question directly to Alex?
I think I did it. I just
hear you.
Really basic background, which is what's the governance system of GPE, and a follow-on is how does GPE manage to encourage or persuade the countries being assisted to dedicate more of their own resources and realign their own priorities to support education with their own national resources rather than, donor resources?
It's a good question, Roger. So on the first front, governance, the global partnership is a constituency-based partnership. We have at the very center the developing countries themselves, which are represented at our board. There are a number of sort of country groupings, developing country groupings on the board. The donor governments, of course, are also represented. They're the ones who are providing the resources. I mentioned the private sector and foundations. There are two separate constituencies. They used to be joined, but they were separated a few years ago. So they're there, and we're, as I said, we're trying to tap into those into their resources more and more. Civil society, both north and south. Teachers associations, both at global level and at national level. Are critical partners. I think I've covered everyone. It's a total, there are about 20 board seats, and they're split among the donors and civil society and developing country partners. And we have an executive committee, and then we have grants committee, finance and risk committee. But the governance is all about the partnership, and it's about ensuring that everyone who's engaged in this endeavor has a seat at the table. In terms of our working with countries to encourage them to increase their domestic financing for education, I'd say it's first of all, countries join the partnership in the first place. They make the application. They signal their interest in being a part of the GPE model, and they understand that, of course, there is, hopefully, as we're successful in our fundraising, significant resources that are made available as a result of that. But they make a commitment. It's part of the principles of the partnership to try to achieve a level of at least 20% of their national budgets. And that happens over time. That's not going, for some countries, it's very, very low, and that's going to take years to get there. But increasingly, the issue isn't just a numerical target. The issue is what is the use? What does the use of that money look like? Can we work in partnership with them and others to ensure that there's a more effective, more efficient use of those resources, so that even if the percentage itself is not growing as much as we would all like, and that's, of course, very difficult, particularly for countries that are involved in conflict and so forth, that the resources that are being made available are being used in a better way. And we also try to do that with donor resources, because if we're putting in a certain amount of money into a country And we very much center the use of those resources around their national education sector plans, and now a new compact specifically related to our grants. But other key donors are, going left, going right, but they're not looking at the national sector plan and the priorities that it spells out as the objective. Then it seems to me that we're wasting resources. So the idea is all the way around to try to use both domestic financing, but also external financing, and in ways that really helps to drive a prioritized agenda. I hope that's
Great.
helpful.
Thanks so much, Alex. We've got a question from Willie. Two questions it looks like. Willie, would you like to unmute and pose your question to Alex?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Question here that are kind of connected about the use of money. Is it safe at a time to use this money in conflict and fragile areas? Isn't it more effective to use it in other places, along with the current nationalism to calling for monies just to be spent at home? They're kind of connected. And then a suggestion. I have a lot of friends who are retired teachers. One of them said, well, I bet a bunch of us would love to go over and help the GPE. And I was so kind of a GPE score. Anyway, just a thought, but back to the questions.
All right, Willie, thank you. First of all, your question of safety, I'm trying to make sure I understand. Are you referring to a possible concern that the monies, given conflict, given instability, might be used in ways that aren't what we intended? Misuse of funds or misappropriation of funds. Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah, when it comes to convincing our members of Congress or members of Parliament, that's a possible objection when so much of the money is going where it's needed, obviously.
Yeah. So the Global Partnership for Education, first of all, we're very similar to, in a sense, other international entities. We don't hand money directly over to a ministry, and certainly not in a situation where you would have political strife and concern about, do you have a legitimate government in place? Is there a question about, where and how resources are being used? We work through grant agents, and particularly in countries that are experiencing some fragility or there's a conflict, UNICEF tends to be our grant agent of choice. They tend to be the on-the-ground presence that remains in these countries, both before, during, and after conflicts. So there's a real stability there. They also have the fiduciary practices and vehicles in place to ensure the appropriate use of funds. And obviously funds are not just handed over in one big lump sum, but they come in tranches depending on how they're being used and whether reporting back is appropriate and so forth. So I think that the safety there is pretty strong. We also have what we call the risk framework that we've had in place now for a good number of years, which sort of identifies countries where the risks might be higher than in other countries and puts in place some procedures and some mechanisms to be doubly sure that in those countries the resources are going to be applied in the appropriate ways. And we have had questions from members of Congress, more in Congress than Parliament. The Canadian Parliament hasn't really posed that question, but in the U.S. Congress, I have had a number of those. In terms of retired teachers and helping GPE, well, it seems to me, first of all, that the work you're doing and your colleagues are doing now by working through organizations like Results is exactly a very critical way and a very valuable way for you to be supporting and helping. In terms of working, if you're considering working at country level, GPE doesn't have itself the mechanisms to help make that happen. I mean, I do know that there are church or faith-affiliated organizations that do that sort of thing. You might also want to contact Education International. They might be able to steer you in the direction that that you would be looking for on that.
Thanks, Alex. Carolyn had an interesting question that she posted in the chat box. Over to you, Carolyn.
Sure, and I see Peter's was before mine, but since I've got the floor, I'll take it. These are two questions about people, children with disabilities. So what specific actions need to be taken or is the GPE taking to reach children with disabilities? And kind of within that, how do you approach the wide variety of disabilities that kids have and, you know, that might require a lot of different approaches? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Given GPE works at the systems level, sort of really stepping back from the specific actions at school level or in a particular area, sort of beginning with upstream policy considerations, the development of national education sector plans, and identifying what are the most urgent priorities in the country. We do encourage our developing country partners and support them to include, as part of our larger equity agenda, the challenge of children with disabilities, including mental disabilities, not just physical disabilities, in their consideration, in their planning, and ultimately in the use of resources, both domestic and external. And my sense is that the response on that, the progress on that is mixed. I think that there are some countries that are potentially doing better with that than others. I think the challenge is perhaps greatest with children facing mental disabilities. We've had a lot of discussions with MP Mike Lake and others who are very interested in this issue. And part of the problem is that the societies themselves, I talked about traditional norms a while back, it is traditional in many societies to basically just shelter the child in some back room somewhere. They'll ensure that that child is fed, ensure that the child has, you know, what its basic needs, but they keep them away from school and they keep them out of sight, so that actually it can become very difficult just to try to confirm how many kids are suffering and what are they suffering from? What are the things that need to be done? Is it something simple like an iodine deficiency that's causing a problem, or is it something much more serious? Huge amount of work needs to be done to improve the understanding and data on that. And we're at the very, very, frankly, early stages, it seems to me, of doing that. So I think ensuring that that children facing with disabilities are recognized to be part of the equation, that consideration is taken as to what policies may need to be put in place, including access issues for children with physical disabilities. I mentioned earlier glasses, something as simple as having testing for vision so that kids who are sitting in the classroom, you can confirm they can see what's on the board. Those are the sorts of things that that our country partners are doing. I would personally like to see more done in this respect, because I think it's, we know from a UNICEF report now probably 8-9 years ago, that perhaps somewhere between 30 and 33%, 1/3 of children who are not in school because of disabilities, either physical or mental. So it's a big issue and it needs more attention.
Yeah, that's a really big figure. Okay, Peter Stoll, if you'd like to take the mic.
Thank you, Alex. I think you pretty much answered my question. It had to do with in-country partnerships and of different groups in the country participating. And then I also had a question whether there is something like a full-time accounting firm that does audits in country. In all the different countries as they randomly choose to check in, like the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and malaria has. Is there such an auditing wing? Do you have a contract with an accounting firm to do that?
So we don't, so we don't do that directly. We work through the grant agents themselves, again, organizations like the World Bank itself or UNICEF. There's some international NGOs as well. They have their own, of course, fiduciary procedures. They might have their own accounting firms or auditing firms to do some of that work. There's a whole process for accreditation of these grant agents that's quite extensive. They have to sign a financial procedures agreement. It's quite quite intense. And I might note that there have been some cases, a relatively small number of cases, where usually the grant agent itself recognizes that there has been some either lack of clarity or some concern about how resources have been used, and they certainly have the support from us, and they have the ability to go after those resources. Funds are frozen until things are addressed, and we of course let the national judiciary system and every single one of those countries has its own financial management rules and accounting rules and procurement rules. If something has gone amiss, we give those countries the chance to use those rules to go through their processes. And typically, it might take a little time in some cases, but the problem is resolved. Resources are accounted for and or returned, and we're able to move on. But it's about, one of the things I mentioned earlier was that kind of coordination at country level. One of the most important features of the Global Partnerships work is what we call generically the local education groups. These are representing all of the major players in education in the country. They work together with the ministry to develop the national education sector plans. They are contributing resources often themselves for the implementation of those plans. But they're a very important pairs of eyes and ears in country. They know often if something is not going right in ways that we might not, sitting in Washington or New York or Ottawa. And they're the ones who tend to sound the alarm if they think something is not going well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, and I'm going to turn the final question from the audience to Ken Patterson before I wrap up the session for us. So Ken, your quick question.
Yeah, Alex, thanks so much for this today. Really appreciate it. Just wondering, based on your intel, what do you know about where the Biden administration is on their knowledge and understanding of GPE? Are you getting any signals from there? Do they know about it? Are they aware of that it's coming up? And are you getting any signals from that? I think most of the folks from the U.S. know that we're hoping for $1 billion pledge from the U.S.
Yeah. First of all, let me just say we were, I think, very lucky and perhaps had some good smarts in the pre-election period of reaching out to some people that we anticipated might wind up in the transition team and or in the administration. We have worked with, during the Obama-Biden administration, we had worked with some of those people. They were in different roles, either at USAID or in the National Security Council. And so we were already having some good engagement with these folks, making sure that they were up to date on GPE. For many of them, GPE was not an unknown entity. They were aware of it. They might have been a little bit out of date. And then when post-election, when the transition team finally took hold, and as you know, that took a while, that was a weird, crazy process, we were able to reach out to the transition team. And in fact, many of the people we had already been in touch with were precisely in the roles we thought they might be in. So we made a number of presentations to them and made sure that they were aware of the moment that is coming up at the end of July. They assured us that, as people come in, are confirmed, like Ambassador Samantha Power to be the new administrator at USAID, that they would ensure that she is aware. Of course, our co-hosts and others there's a lot of outreach beginning to take place between, as part of the G7 process, if not the summit itself. There's already quite a bit of exchange since global education, and particularly girls' education, have been put on the agenda for the G7. So I feel pretty good about the interactions that we've had so far. I was part of a transition process myself about 30 years ago, and I know that that indeed, when you've had those kinds of presentations and those discussions, they find their way. They're on paper. They get to the people that you're trying to reach. So I think the answer is, I'm very hopeful. I think that there is a recognition. It's not a piece of cake necessarily, because there's a lot of demands and a lot of expectations.
Yeah.
I can tell you that what they call the skinny budget, meaning very high level, it doesn't have all the details, that have been produced by the Biden administration for its first budget, the FY22 proposed budget, does include additional resources. They're not just comparing it to the Trump requests, because those were so devastating, you sort of just throw them off the table, but compared to the congressional response and the FY21 levels, which did see an increase for GPE and others, and they're looking for more money. Now, how much of that is for global education and or for GPE, we're not fully sure of that just yet. But I think that this administration that's come in recognizes the importance of its role in global development, the opportunity for leadership in this particular regard. And I'm also think that when you throw this into the mix of the G7, things happen that otherwise wouldn't happen.
Thank you.
Great. So we are at time, so we are going to wrap up. Alex, I will give you the final word in a second. But first, if everybody could please use their clapping hand emoji to give a big round of applause for Alex Palacios with the Global Partnership for Education. We really appreciate your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure to be able to pick your brain ahead of our campaigning work, which hopefully will be successful in mobilizing resources for the partnership. Alex, I will hand it over to you to give our final closing remarks. Hopefully something inspiring that leaves us ready to go and take action alongside the Raise Your Hand campaign. Thanks again. Over to you, Alex, to close.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you. Great questions. And I feel like I'm at home when I'm with this particular community. To think that my first meeting was a sort of official meeting results, it was Sam's Kitchen on Capitol Hill in Washington. That was it. That was the office. And it was an education, I must say. I do think that we are kind of in a best of times, worst of times situation. It seems to me that COVID has created such a major challenge across the board. You're going to see resources needed in global health, in nutrition, and in all sorts of areas. Climate change, of course, is a huge issue. We're seeing it, we're living it every day. But I think that the work of organizations like Results and other advocacy partners, GPE itself, some leaders who've really understood that this is an issue that hasn't had the level of attention that it requires, that all that together has allowed us to move the rock up the hill in a way globally that wasn't there for education a generation ago. Certainly when I was at USAID, education was a tiny piece of the agenda. It's a very different dynamic today. And I think that's because of the great job that you all have done. However, that rock isn't just going to stay up there by itself. We're going to have to keep pushing, I'm afraid. At least we know it's up there higher than it's been before, but we're going to have to keep shoring it up. So thank you for all your work. I am available at any time to answer your questions. And I just did really want to let Robin know, I really wish my name were Pelosi, because if it were, gosh, we would be in great shape.
Oh, sorry about that. Tripped myself
okay.
up.
I've just spoken fun.
No, that's great. Okay, bye everyone. Have a
Thank
great
you
day.
all. Bye-bye.